She walked in confident. She walked out broken. In between, something happened inside the European Parliament that has not happened in the institution's entire history. Not a vote of no confidence, not a parliamentary censure, not a formal motion or a procedural challenge or any of the official mechanisms that European institutional politics uses to manage the removal of leaders it has decided to discard. What happened was rawer than any of that, more public, more permanent, more devastating in the specific way that only complete and total humiliation in front of the entire world can be devastating to someone whose entire political identity is built on the appearance of untouchable authority. The laughter started on the second sentence, not from one corner, not from the opposition benches alone, from across the chamber. Open, audible, contemptuous laughter directed at the most powerful unelected executive in the Western world, while she stood at a microphone with shaking hands and a breaking voice, attempting to read from a folder of prepared remarks as if scripted words could meet a moment that was screaming for something real. Outside those walls, 60,000 people were already in the streets. The number was still climbing. And inside that chamber, something that cannot be rebuilt was breaking in real time on camera in front of tens of millions of people across an entire continent. This is not a political story. This is a collapse, the kind that happens once in a generation, and it happened in a single morning. Ursula von der Leyen did not walk into the European Parliament that morning believing she was walking into the end of her political life. That is the first thing you need to understand about what happened. Because the way a leader enters a room tells you everything about what they expect the room to do to them. And she entered that chamber the way she has always entered it, flanked by security, surrounded by senior advisors moving in tight formation beside her, a folder of carefully prepared remarks tucked under her arm, her face set in the expression she has spent decades perfecting at the highest levels of European power, composed, certain, slightly unreachable. The look of a leader who has absorbed everything that has ever been thrown at her and emerged intact every single time. She had every reason to believe this morning would follow the same pattern. She had survived the Pfizer text message scandal when the European Parliament demanded answers and the European Ombudsman found maladministration and the Belgian federal prosecutor launched a criminal investigation, and she stonewalled every single one of them until the news cycle moved on. She had survived the Green Deal collapse when the farmers blocked highways across Europe and her signature policy agenda crumbled under political pressure, and she retreated from every commitment she had made without ever publicly acknowledging the retreat for what it was. She had survived the energy crisis, the migration catastrophe, the agricultural revolts, the diplomatic embarrassments, the accusations of centralizing power in ways that EU treaty law does not permit, the internal commission revolt that was building in documents her own team was desperately trying to suppress. She had bent under all of it. She had never broken. That was her brand. That was her armor. That was the political identity she had constructed her entire legacy upon. And she walked into that chamber that morning wearing it like it was indestructible. It was not indestructible. What was waiting for her inside that building was something her armor had never been designed to stop. Because the attack that came did not come from the direction she had always prepared for. It did not come from the far right or the nationalist blocs or the Eurosceptic movements that had spent years building political careers around opposing everything she represented. It did not come from Viktor Orban's allies or the Identity and Democracy Group or any of the organized opposition forces whose strategy she understood well enough to have prepared responses ready before they finished speaking. It came from inside, from her own political family, from a German member of the European Parliament who was by every definition of the word supposed to be her ally, her defender, one of the human shields standing between her position and the forces that wanted it dismantled. When he rose from his seat, the chamber shifted. Veterans who had sat in that room for decades said afterward that they felt it before they understood it. Not the familiar tension of a contested vote or the electric anticipation of a difficult debate. Something heavier, something that felt less like politics and more like a door being opened that could never be closed again. He did not shout. He did not perform outrage for the cameras in the practiced way that European parliamentary speakers learn to perform outrage without actually feeling it. His voice was controlled, deliberate, and devastating in the specific way that only genuine conviction delivered without theatrics can be devastating in a room full of people trained to recognize the difference. He said he could no longer remain silent about what he was watching happen to the institution he had dedicated his career to serving. He said the European Union had become something its founders would not recognize and would not defend. He said that decades of diplomatic credibility, alliances built through sacrifice and crisis, and the commitment of entire generations of European leaders had been destroyed in a matter of months through a combination of arrogance, detachment, and incompetence so complete that it defied any rational explanation he was capable of offering. He said European citizens were suffering in ways that were real, measurable, and permanent, while the Commission leadership remained willfully disconnected from the reality those citizens were living every single day in their homes, their workplaces, their communities, and their futures. And then he said the words that detonated the entire room. Ursula von der Leyen must resign immediately for the good of Europe. The reaction was instantaneous and total. Half the chamber erupted in applause that veterans said shook the walls in a way they had not felt in 30 years of sitting in that building. The other half sat in a silence so suffocating it had its own physical weight. Von der Leyen's face went pale in real time. On camera, in front of millions of people watching live across the continent. Her hands found the edge of her desk and gripped it with both hands, and the cameras were already closing in, already capturing every flicker, every crack, every trace of the panic moving across her features in a moment she could not control and could not walk back and could not manage with any communication strategy her team had ever prepared for any previous crisis. But what that German representative started, the chamber was only beginning to finish, because before the applause had reached its full height, the second strike was already incoming. A French representative was already on her feet. And she did not come with broad philosophical accusations that could be deflected or argued around in the procedural language that European parliamentary debate normally provides as cover for avoiding direct accountability. She came with specifics. She came with the specific language of someone who had been preparing this moment carefully and had decided that preparation was finished and the moment had arrived. She cataloged the diplomatic catastrophe with Washington, the complete and humiliating refusal of the American administration to treat European leadership as a serious counterpart in any significant international negotiation. She described watching transatlantic alliances that had guaranteed European security and European relevance on the world stage since the end of the Second World War erode in real time. Not because of geopolitical forces beyond anyone's control, because of what she called arrogant, incompetent, and deeply irresponsible management of relationships that an entire generation of European statesmen had dedicated their careers to building, protecting, and passing on intact to their successors. She placed the responsibility directly on von der Leyen by name, without hesitation, without a single softening qualifier, without the diplomatic cushioning that European parliamentary language normally requires as the price of being taken seriously in that institution. The applause after her statement was louder than after the first. The energy in that chamber had crossed a threshold. It was no longer the shock energy of something unexpected happening. It had become the momentum energy of something that once it begins moving at that speed in that direction, does not stop on its own. Then the Italian representative rose. He did not wait for formal recognition from the chamber president. He simply began speaking with the raw edge of someone who had finally and completely exhausted every reserve of patience he had spent years maintaining in service of an institutional decorum that the morning had already destroyed beyond recovery. He talked about economic devastation moving through his country in waves, factories closing permanently in regions where manufacturing had been the foundation of community life for generations. unemployment climbing to levels that were hollowing out entire towns, small businesses collapsing under the weight of regulatory frameworks designed in Brussels by people who had never run a business, never struggled to make payroll, never watched the work of a lifetime disappear because of a directive written by someone sitting in a comfortable office thousands of kilometers from the consequences of their decisions. He said Italian workers were desperate in ways that official statistics did not capture and Brussels press releases did not acknowledge. He said Italian young people were leaving their country in numbers that represented a generational hemorrhage because they could see no future at home that the current European economic framework was going to provide for them. And the person responsible for that framework, he said, was standing right there in that chamber behind a folder of prepared remarks, and no folder of prepared remarks was going to be sufficient for this morning. By the time he finished, the chamber was in open revolt. Representatives from Poland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Austria, and Spain rose in sequence to deliver their own verdicts. The language had abandoned every convention of parliamentary civility. It was brutal and direct and completely unfiltered in the way that language only becomes when the people speaking it have stopped calculating the political consequences of their words and started saying what they actually believe in front of every camera in the building. And through all of it, von der Leyen sat at her desk, gripping its edge, her composure cracking piece by piece under the accumulated weight of something she had no prepared answer for because no preparation had ever modeled this specific scenario. Her own people, her own chamber, her own political family, all at once. She raised her hand. She attempted to interject. She requested the floor and was simply ignored by a chamber president who was visibly struggling to maintain any semblance of procedural control over a session that had left procedure behind 30 minutes earlier. Being ignored at a microphone is itself a humiliation of historic proportions for a sitting commission president. But what happened the moment she finally reached that microphone, the moment she finally opened her mouth to respond to everything that had been said about her in that room, is the moment that nobody present and nobody watching will ever be able to forget. Because what broke next was not just her composure, it was not just her authority or her political standing or her carefully constructed public image. What broke next was something far larger and far more permanent. And the 60,000 people already filling the streets of Brussels outside those walls knew it before the words had even left her mouth. So what did she say? And why did an entire chamber of elected representatives respond to the most powerful woman in Europe with open, undisguised, wall-to-wall laughter that was heard live by tens of millions of people across the continent and shared in clips that had reached 100 million views before the session was even formally closed?